A lot of people claim that the Bible justifies slavery. Let's take a look at that today. If we look at the Old Testament and specifically the Torah, we see a lot of verses about slavery and how to treat, manage, and deal with your slaves. But what we have to realize is long before the Mosaic Law was revealed, slavery was a common practice. It was everywhere and everyone participated in it. This means that the Mosaic Law didn't create slavery, nor did it end it, which is the main point of contention we're going to tackle today. The Mosaic Law gave rules and regulations on slavery and how it should be done, rather than outlawing it. But why? Why didn't God just outlaw it? Well, first, what we have to look at is the fact that the Mosaic Law was to prepare the people for the New Testament. And Jesus himself said that Moses allowed things due to the hardness of people's hearts. In Matthew 19:8, Jesus says to the Pharisees that Moses allowed divorce at the time due to the hardness of the Israelites' heart. It's like when a government creates certain drug laws to curb certain issues in society. The bad thing to do is just to outright criminalize drugs when drugs have become commonplace. Instead, the better option is to wean the population off of that practice by creating safe and ethical ways to participate in these dangerous and immoral acts, instead of having them doing it without the guidelines of a higher power. That is just like what God did with slavery. He didn't just outlaw it since the people at that time would still engage in it. Instead, he set guidelines to it. The Mosaic Law is not an end-all law for moral examples we should follow today. Of course, we can still gain wisdom from it, but it was revealed to the Israelites, a group of people who were too wicked to outright ban slavery. And it was used to try to get those people one step closer to walking more righteously. So in short, the regulation of something is not the promotion of it. And again, we know this from God's strong disdain for divorce, as seen in Malachi 2:15. Yet, we still see the regulation of it throughout the Old and New Testament. Now I think we must define and differentiate the transatlantic slave trade to ancient Near Eastern slavery. The transatlantic slave trade was based on race. It was built on the idea that some people were less human than others, and therefore you could kidnap them, force them into slavery, and treat them as you please. The biggest thing to remember is that this kind of slavery is based on race, and is driven by kidnapping. During the transatlantic slave trade, things like beating, forced procreation, and R-wording were all commonplace. And this is what people tend to think about when they hear the word slavery. But this is not what went on in Israel. And this is not how God regulated it for the Israelites. We know many aspects of African slavery and Israelite slavery were vastly different. Since with Israelite slavery, they were not allowed to beat, kill, rape, or kidnap their slaves. And we're going to look at scripture to see what the Bible actually says about slavery. You know, instead of just out of context verses, which a lot of critics love to do, just to make God seem immoral. Rape was not allowed under any circumstances back in ancient Israel, and it was punishable by death. This would lead to any kinds of unwanted sexual relations with your slave would be against the regulations. We also know that sex outside of marriage was not allowed, again making the R-wording of your slaves against the regulations of God. We know that rape was just one of the many heinous atrocities that took place during the transatlantic slave trade, but the slavery regulated by the Mosaic Law had laws against those acts. This goes to show that the Mosaic Law was a law made to prepare people whose hearts were hardened, and was still a major advancement for human rights. In Exodus 21, verse 16, it says that anyone who is found kidnapping or in possession of someone who has been kidnapped, they shall be put to death. This law alone condemns the transatlantic slave trade, as its whole foundation was built on kidnapping Africans and then selling them across the Atlantic. There'd be no way for someone to buy or sell any kidnapped people under God's regulations of slavery, as it is outright banned and punishable by death. Now if we look at Exodus 21, verse 26 and 27, it says that if you strike your slave and their eye is damaged or they lose a tooth, you shall set them free. Now when God says this, it's clear he isn't just concerned about teeth or a black eye, but rather just overall bodily harm. The next verse that we're looking at is one that I've been getting a lot of my comments. Exodus 21, verse 20 to 21. It says that if you beat your slave and they die under your hand, you shall be punished. But if he lives a day or two, you shall not be punished. People like to take this verse out of context and say that you can beat your slave within an inch of their life. And if they're fine, you can't be punished. But if we look at the Hebrew word that was translated into punish, it is the Hebrew word for avenge, which in many cases is used more for a life kind of punishment. Meaning that it's not saying that you shall see no consequences for beating your slave. Rather, you just won't be put to death for it, as you didn't kill them. And again, as we went over earlier in the same chapter, it says if you beat your slave, and they lose a tooth or have damage to their eye, they shall be set free. Now do you guys see how the skeptics just took that right out of context? They build a whole false idea about what the Bible teaches just because of little snippets. When if they actually just read the whole chapter, or the whole Bible preferably, they would see that no, you can't just beat your slave within an inch of their life and see no consequences. They'd be set free if you did that. You just wouldn't be killed. Next, let's look in Deuteronomy, where it says that if you find a runaway slave, you are to help them, give them shelter, and not oppress them. This is completely opposite to what happened during the transatlantic slave trade, where they would routinely go on slave hunts for runaway slaves. They would either kill them or bring them back to their masters. What God regulated for the Israelites is to allow for mistreated slaves of masters who were breaking the regulations we went over earlier, to actually escape and then be protected by the community. Next, we can look at Leviticus 25, where it talks about how Israelite slaves can go back to their land promised to them by God, while non-Israelite slaves would have to stay with their masters and could be passed down as inheritance. Atheists and other non-believers love to take this verse out of context and say that you can own people and do what you will with them, but nowhere in that verse does it speak about that. We have to remember it firstly speaks about Israelite slaves being freed on the year of Jubilee, which is a time that comes every 50 years where all the debts and slave contracts of the Israelites are given up. But this leads to an issue for the non-Israelites or the Gentile slaves. They do not have any land to go back to as they are not of Israel. This means that they would have to serve out the rest of their contracts, however long that may be. But as we already went over in the other passages, this wouldn't be a kidnapping situation, as you aren't allowed to kidnap. This wouldn't be speaking about any abusive situations, as the slave could run away and seek help from the community if the masters were breaking any of the regulations given by God. Now you might say, well, isn't God racist then? He clearly allows better rights to one group of people based on their bloodline. This is a common misconception about Israel. In ancient Israel, you could be grafted into Israel based on your belief in the one true God of Abraham. Despite what many Talmudic Jews will tell you, ancient Israel had Gentiles grafted into the nation based on their belief in Yah. In the Old Testament, Israel was a body of believers, and to remain in the body of Israel, you had to be obedient to the covenant. While strangers or Gentiles who also did so would be considered native born and granted all the same privileges. We see all throughout the Old Testament, Gentiles were grafted into the nation and called true believers. We have Melchizedek, who was called a high priest in Genesis 14:18. There's also the Canaanite Rahab, who confessed the God of Israel was Lord. She was married into the family of Israel and was in the direct line of Jesus himself. Ruth, the Moabite, married an Israelite, and after his death, she joined herself to Israel and the Lord by declaring, "Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God." And finally, when Moses led his people out of Egypt, there was a mixed multitude that went along with them. This mixed multitude of people could have been any other nationality that had been in Egypt at that time, who feared the true Lord and were grafted into Israel. And after Moses freed his people, God gave laws to Israel concerning the Passover feast. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and let him come near and keep it, and he shall be as a native of the land. Exodus 12:48. The stranger was to be counted as a native of the land, so long as he participated in the worship of the one true God. So no, God isn't a racist, he isn't a nationalist, he simply had favoritism towards people that believed in him. But even if they chose to continue on in their unbelief, they were still granted basic human rights and protections. The next point people like to bring up about slavery and Christianity is the use of the Bible to justify slavery. The thing no one brings up when they try to use this as a dunk on the morality of God is that man had to corrupt and remove multiple books and verses from the Bible to justify it. This would mean that in no way was the transatlantic slave trade a reflection of what God wanted us to live as. It is pretty evident that the Bible did not create slavery, rather we, the wicked humans, did as a consequence of our sin. Our wicked nature led us to exploit and take advantage of people and enslave them, while it was God who took the first steps to get rid of it. I don't even have to bring up how most of the abolitionists used the uncorrupted Bible to denounce and condemn slavery. But that just further cements the fact about Christianity being anti-slavery. But before you go, I thought I'd leave you with a verse.
Just as a body, though one, has many parts, and all its parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we are all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink.